Mhm. Hey, good afternoon. Good afternoon, everyone. It is Whiteboard Wednesday, and it is currently June 2nd, and it's 5:30-ish, 5:35, according to my time here, my watch. And we're doing Whiteboard Wednesday a little bit different time. So if you're watching Whiteboard Wednesday and it's June 2nd and you're watching it, let's say our normal time at 7 o'clock, you can still watch, but it won't be live. I went live at 5:30, 5:34, 5:33, somewhere in there. Diane's there. Hi, Diane. Good to see you. Um, yeah, sorry about last couple weeks. Have stuff at the church happening, and in fact, stuff again today happening on Wednesdays. Wednesdays can sometimes be tough, but I wanted to do Whiteboard Wednesday again. So I had to do it a little earlier. So hopefully that doesn't throw anybody off. You should still be able to watch it whenever you can, but just know that I won't be able to respond to you unless you're watching it June 2nd. Unless it's June 2nd around 5:30, you're not watching it live. I don't know if you're able to tell if you're watching a live or recorded, but anyway, that's where we're at. That is where we're at. It is Wednesday though, and this is a whiteboard, so it's Whiteboard Wednesday. WW. Um, WW. Hope you had a good Memorial Day weekend. We've been talking about how we know that the Bible's trustworthy, how we can trust that the Bible's accurate, maybe, let's say, and what the Bible is. It's the collection of works, ancient documents, and things like that. I wanted to ask a similar question, maybe a more general question, and that is, how do we know God exists? Oh, look at this. Crystal Gibbons is watching. She looks cute. She looks cute. Maybe I'll ask her on a date. Crystal, would you like to go on a date with me? I got distracted. Saw that beautiful Crystal in the chat there, and I got distracted. What was I talking about? How do we know God exists? That's what I was going to ask. Are there any reasons to believe that we may have to know that God exists? Sometimes Christians stumble over this because we hear a lot about faith, but then there's this other thing called that we have. Hey, Carol's there too. Uh, oh, thanks, Ed. Yeah, sorry, Carol. I had to do a different time. We hear a lot called faith, and now, okay, just so everybody knows, Crystal is my wife. Okay. We hear a lot about faith and just trusting and believing, right? But faith, we've talked about this in several Whiteboard Wednesdays past. It is my opinion that faith has gotten a bad rap, and people use the word faith as if it's some kind of magical thing, and that some people have faith and some people don't have faith, and the key thing is just to close your eyes real tight and believe. That's not what faith means. I've talked about that before. Faith is the same word as trust, and we have faith in all sorts of things. Faith is it's what you have faith in is the question. So do we have faith in God? Do we put our trust in God or not is the important question. But people use the word faith like a kind of a magic word. And but we have this other thing called reason. God has given us a brain, and we should be able to use our brain. It's not just the case that we just have faith that God exists, but I want to let us know that we also have reasons to believe that God exists. There's also reasons that would back up this trust. That is, we have reasons to trust God, right? And I want to share some of those to you today. Not so much maybe trust God, but reasons to believe that God exists, besides maybe how some people think of it in terms of wishful thinking. And I don't like that idea. I don't think the Bible likes that idea. In 1 Corinthians chapter 15, I'll write this is maybe a little side note. 1 Corinthians 15, Paul the author, is talking about the importance of Jesus being resurrected, raised from the dead. And he says, if Jesus is not raised from the dead, if it's the case that Jesus did not raise from the tomb, then uh, first thing means all the apostles are lying. It means the church is built on lies and not true. And if you have faith in Jesus, then your faith is worthless. That's what Paul says in 1 Corinthians 15. It's not the case that faith is just some magical thing that you say, well, I have faith, and even if Jesus isn't risen, I have faith that he's risen. Paul says, I'm sorry to say, but people ought to pity us if what we're believing isn't actually true. So even the Bible, all this to say, even the Bible seems to think that faith is important, but what you have faith in is important. If we're having faith in something that isn't real, then people ought to feel sorry for us at the end of the day. But I want us to be sure and to at least have that peace of mind to know that there are reasons to believe. There are reasons to think that this is true. And so the question I want to look at today is, what are some reasons that we could say that God exists? Are there any? Some people say, are there any arguments for God's existence? I don't know if you've ever heard of arguments for God's existence, where we would be able to say, well, you just believe that God exists. Are there any arguments for it? Another word, and I don't know if I've used this word before on Whiteboard Wednesday, but there's a word, I spelled that kind of funny, that Christians have used over the ages called apologetics. I don't know if you ever heard that phrase, but apologetics means, it basically means arguments for God's existence. So it sounds like apology. It doesn't mean an apology. It goes back to an old Greek word where we get the word apology from, but it's like if you're giving a defense of something. So if there's a trial going on and there's a defense attorney, they would be given an apology for whatever they're believing. So when it comes to Christianity, if you're at all interested in this, you might want to look into this field of apologetics, which talks about arguments for God's existence. So I want to look at a couple arguments for God's existence that not just Christians, but even people from other religions also have similar arguments. Like I said, this is a more general question than just how do we know the Bible is accurate. That's a very Christian thing we would be concerned about, but how do we know God's real? It maybe is more general. And first of all, before we look at some arguments, I want to share a few of the popular arguments for God's existence. Before we do that, though, I would say, and I believe this is many of our experience, and even the Bible mentions this, that you don't necessarily need, some people don't, rather, need arguments for God's existence. We have, and is our understanding that the Holy Spirit is what the Bible calls an inner witness in our spirits, in our personal spirits, and our souls. The Holy Spirit communicates to us, or at least some of us, this is more assuring than others, but just an assurance that this is true. And it is the case for Christians that we have this experience inside where we just feel that God exists, right? And I know I poo-pooed faith a little bit ago, but I don't want to. I just meant the bad definition of faith, where you just kind of use it as a get out of jail free card. But it is the case that we do have an experience of God, right? We just kind of feel that He's there and feel that He's real. Or maybe if you don't feel it all the time, there is more than likely times in your life where you have felt those moments, and we have this inner witness. And I would say that's wonderful. And if that's one of the reasons you have for believing in God, well, that's a wonderful reason, and that's great. Hang your hat on that, especially in times of doubt. But here's the difficult part with this. I say the difficult part with the Holy Spirit. Hope you don't misunderstand me. The difficult part is communicating that to another person who has not experienced that. So someone that you know who does not believe in God, when you start talking in terms of Holy Spirit, and I just feel that God is real, and God speaks to me, and has this experience of God, it it can fall flat to someone who hasn't experienced that. And so, though this is a good thing and a wonderful thing, and we want to hang on to those things, nevertheless, there are some times where it might be necessary to give reasons besides that other people, even if they don't have a relationship with God, that other people, even if they didn't have the relationship, would still see that, yes, even if I think this through, it does make sense that God is real. So hopefully that makes sense. So this is a great thing, this inner witness of the Holy Spirit, but sometimes that can be hard to communicate. I would say, before we get into some arguments for God's existence, if you are trying to communicate with someone the existence of God, well, there's a couple things. A person may, here I'm worried I'm going to keep rambling. I got to stop rambling and just get right to it, Chad. There's people who question whether God is real, but then there's some people that they have just a general belief that there is maybe a God somewhere, or they do believe that there is some kind of spirituality to existence, but they maybe are hesitant to would say that Jesus is Lord, right? That Jesus is God. So those are two separate questions. So depending on who you're talking to, you might need to address those questions differently. So today we're just talking about the general question of God existing. So if someone thinks, is there reasons for God just to exist in general? This is what we're talking about. So one of the things that's very, one of the main arguments, let's say, that apologetics uses, or apologists are people who give a defense of the Christian faith, is what they call the cosmological argument. Cosmological argument, kind of a fancy, some of these have fancy terms, but is very simple, and you have probably came up with or thought of the cosmological argument yourself. If you thought at all about an argument for believing that God exists, you probably thought something like the cosmological argument at some point. It says basically something like this. Everything, would it be quicker to type? Let me try typing. This is be a new for Whiteboard Wednesday. I'm going to type something instead of write something. Let's see how this goes. You guys will be the guinea pigs. Can't stretch this box. So far it's not going well. Oh, okay, good. Everything that begins to exist has a cause. Can I not stretch this? Whoop. There. So we would, that's kind of intuitively true. I think everybody kind of believes that. If something exists, it has a cause to exist. I'm speaking into this microphone right here. Can you see this microphone? This microphone didn't come out of nowhere, right? Somebody made it, right? You're watching this on a computer or a television or something. That television has a reason it exists, right? Everything that exists, everything that begins to exist, has a reason for it existing, right? Here's a mouse, myself, yourself. You didn't pop out of nowhere without a reason. You had parents, right? This is intuitively true. Everything that begins to exist has a cause. Here's the second thing. The universe began to exist. Right? We're living in the universe. It must have begun somewhere. Scientists even tell us we get the Big Bang or whatever. It began to exist, right? It's here. I'm in the universe. You're in the universe. These are all very everybody believes these things to be true. Well, if you believe the first one and if you believe the second one, then we have to believe that the universe has a cause, right? It didn't just pop out of nowhere, right? It has some kind of reason to exist. So, and that's basically it, right? Very simple and counterintuitive argument. If something exists, something created it, right? The universe exists. something must have created the universe. Now, this is where people who don't believe in God can get a little, because it starts getting scary for some people to think that God might be real. So they start to look for other avenues besides God to explain it away. So some people will say, well, the universe really, it just kind of popped. It came out of nowhere, right? And maybe you've even heard that before. Then people believe that the universe just came out of nowhere. Well, to believe that is to disagree with what everybody kind of knows to be true, that things don't do that, right? If all of a sudden if see my hands here, if all of a sudden a basketball appeared in my hands, or a baseball, let's say, you would want to know, well, what was the reason? How did that happen, right? It should have a reason. If a horse appeared behind me, right? Wouldn't it be logical to wonder, what was the reason for that horse? What how did it get there? And for you to just say, well, it just popped into existence out of nowhere. It wouldn't. Everybody knows that doesn't happen, right? So you take that baseball and let's imagine a basketball, or the horse, or something bigger than a car, or a house, or a whole planet just coming on into existence out of nowhere, or a whole solar system, or the bigger things get, the more outlandish the idea seems that things can just come to existence out of nowhere. And well, why would it be different for the entire universe? I'm maybe kind of botching this argument a little bit, but I think you understand the point. If something exists, it had a cause, right? If something begins to exist, rather, it had a cause. The universe began to exist. That means the universe must have had some kind of cause from outside the universe. So some people will, and I don't want to belabor this, some people say, well, yeah, came out of nothing. Came out of nothing. This is thing, a lot of atheists will say that, people who don't believe in God, it came out of absolutely nothing. But then when you ask them what that means, they don't really answer it. So like scientists will say this sometimes, it came out of nothing. But when what they're talking about is nothing, is some kind of like, they'll start to talk about quantum mechanics and like all sorts of quantum objects and stuff, things popping in and out of existence out of nowhere. Well, this kind of quantum vacuum that they call it, that they say the universe came out of, the quantum vacuum is not nothing. That's something, right? So when we say nothing, we mean like not. How do you get from not existence to existence, right? You don't really, when I say really, you don't go from not existing to existing without a cause, right? Without a reason, without a creator. I don't want to belabor the cosmological argument point. Some people will say also, maybe you've heard the multiverse. Well, the universe is just a kind of a random universe. It's part of a multiverse of millions and infinity of other universes that are all existing, and we just happen to be existing in one of these universes. They call it the multiverse. I spelled that wrong. Multiverse. Movies like to have multiverse. Science fiction movies like to have multiverses. Here again, let's say, okay, fine, there is a multiverse and there's millions and billions of other universes. You would still have to ask the question, where did this whole thing come from, right? Where did that whole process come from? That sounds even more impressive than the universe. And if God decided to do that way, fine. But you would still have to explain that, right? You would still have to explain this whole conglomeration of universes. It sounds like it's something even harder to explain. Or the other option for the creation of the universe is some kind of transcendent mind that brought it into creation. In other words, God. We would call that, everybody just calls that being God. Okay, that's the cosmological argument. I kind of butcher some of these at some points, and I apologize for that. But if you're interested in it, something to look at. If you're not interested in this kind of stuff, then don't worry about it. Again, same as the last couple Whiteboard Wednesdays. Some people don't find these compelling at all. Another argument people give is similar to the first one, is similar to the cosmological argument, is the first cause argument. And I could be, some people call it the first, Aquinas calls it the first mover. In fact, Aristotle did too. This guy Aristotle, even before Jesus, kind of his argument for God was there needs to be a first mover. So let's picture, so right now I've got this pen in my hand. My hand's holding this pen here. Here's a terrible drawing of a hand. Looks like I'm holding it backwards. But my pen is writing on the screen, right? Well, so this line that you're seeing in front of you on the screen, I'll write the word hi. Hi. How did this line come into existence? Well, there's a pen that maybe you're not seeing, but there's a pen that's moving. Here's what my thing looks like. Let me show it to you. You see this? So here's when I drag this pen across this screen, things happen, right? So this line is being caused by this pen, right? And the pen is being moved by, well, here you go. The pen is being moved by my hand. Well, what's moving my hand? Well, my arm is moving my hand, right? Well, what's causing my arm to move? Well, you would say, I drew over my whole thing. You would say, well, I've got these little neurons in my head that are sending signals in my brain that are sending signals for my arm to move, right? At least that's how scientists say it works. That I got these neurons that are telling me how it works. Well, what's causing those neurons to do that? Well, you would say, well, I don't know. I guess I'm thinking, hey, I want my arm to move, and then my brain is firing off neurons to do that. Well, what's causing me to think those thoughts? Well, let's say we'll think like scientists or something like that and say, well, there must be atoms. You're made up of atoms or whatever, and they're bouncing around and apparently they're bouncing around in such a way that are causing you to think those thoughts. Well, what's causing those atoms to bounce around in this way? And then maybe a scientist would say something like, well, I mean, there's these forces. We have gravity that exists throughout the universe. There's a force that holds atoms together. You remember in science class? Got these atoms spinning around. You got protons and neutrons and electrons, right? And there's a electromagnetic force that holds the atom together. But there's these fundamental forces in the universe, and then, well, what's holding these fundamental forces together? Where did these come from? So, in this argument, you're kind of going back in time to ask what created it, what began to exist. But in this argument, you're saying for anything to even move around or change, right? And we all know things move around. Something has to be, and this is what Aristotle said, there has to be an unmoved mover around which everything gets its movement from. There has to be an uncaused cause. Because if that thing was moving itself, it would need a reason for movement. Something would have to be behind it for it to move. If it was, he says, an uncaused cause, meaning it didn't begin to exist. It must have always existed. Otherwise, because if it began to exist, then you would also need a reason for that. So there's got to be something at bottom grounding all this movement and all this cause that we see, and it has to be unmoved and it has to be uncaused. It has to be eternal, basically, right? And so when you start thinking about an eternal mind that's causing all these things or giving everything reason to exist in the first place, again, we call this, everybody just, the name we give that, I hate to even say the word thing. The name we give that being is God, right? Without this, you have what they call an infinite regress. Meaning, if you were to not believe in God, you'd have to say, well, there is no first cause. Everything's just kind of moving, and the further back you go, there is no stop to it. You can just keep going further back and further back and further back. That would lead to an infinite regress, which is logically impossible, because something needs. My alarm went off. Something needs. Let's say if you're going to set a ladder on your roof to climb up to your roof, right? You'd have to set your ladder on something, right? For something to exist, you have to have some kind of foundation for it to exist upon, if you understand that analogy. So maybe these are kind of complex, and I apologize for that. Here's a couple more maybe that are a little bit less so. There's all sorts of design arguments. How long have I been going? Half an hour already? I might have to cut some of these short. Design arguments. What are these kind of arguments? Well, you look around the universe and you look around at creation, and there's all sorts of wonderful design. And if there is design, then it seems like there must be a designer, right? So, and we all kind of intuitively know that's the case. If you were to, I heard somebody say, if you were to walk along the beach, here's the shore here, the waves are crashing up on the beach, and there's rocks strewn about the beach. Well, let's say you were to come across some rocks in this shape. You would think, oh, somebody must have spelled the word high in rocks, right? As you're looking at it. If you just looked randomly, you'd think, oh, there's some random rocks over here. But somebody must have been behind this one, right? There's order to it. There's structure to it. And we look at the universe, what do we see? We see order. We see structure, right? Think about the little atom that's going around. Think about the electron that's going around the protons and the neutrons in here. That is evidence of some great order, right? This electron's just doing it. Everything is just doing it. There's all sorts of laws of nature, right? Gravity works, light works. There's all sorts of order to this. Well, that would make us think that there must be some kind of, again, mind behind this whole thing, because it seems to be designed that way. And when some of these are very fascinating, when you look at to all the things that had to take place for planets to exist or for life to exist. You know, scientists say gravity has to be so strong. If gravity were a little bit stronger, then all matter in the universe would just collapse in on itself. If gravity, if the force of gravity were a little bit weaker, then all the elements in the universe would just scatter apart. You wouldn't even be able to have planets. But because gravity is just exactly perfect, then you can have planets and you can have elements and you can have life. And because the electromagnetic force is just exactly the way it is, you can have electrons and protons. And because this force over here is exactly the way it is, and the more and more we study the universe, the more and more we find that everything exists it has to exist in an absolute perfect number for even anything to exist at all. And for that to happen, there must be some kind of mind behind it. It's a clear evidence, right, that something has designed this whole thing. If you're interested in like more details on this stuff, just look up apologetics or design arguments. They're very, very fascinating, but there's so much that I can't keep them in my head. I'm not the best at this kind of stuff, but I just wanted to, again, let you know that it's there. Some people give moral arguments for God's existence. That is, you and I and everybody on earth knows, unless you really fight against knowing it, or there's some kind of something psychologically wrong with you. We know that there's a right and a wrong. So, and different cultures over time have had different rules that they've set up. Some cultures say some things are okay, and some cultures say other things are okay. But every culture that has ever existed thinks that there is a right and a wrong, right? So if you torture a baby, everybody knows that that's wrong. You don't need to be taught that that's wrong. If somebody abuses their spouse or something like that, that's wrong. And we all know it's wrong. And society and the whole in humanity is built in such a way that when someone does something wrong, something in us goes, that's wrong. That needs to be corrected. That needs to be punished. Or even we need to tell them that's wrong, right? And even the fact that you would want to argue with somebody at all tells you that there's some kind of standard in your head that you understand, and that you also believe the other person understands, so that you can even have an argument with them. So if you came up and punched me in the face, I could say that's wrong, right? And the reason I could say that's wrong is because I think, and I know you think, that we believe that punching someone in the face is wrong, right? And so I'm arguing based on some kind of outside standard. It's not just my own personal feelings on the matter. I just personally feel that torturing a little baby is wrong. No, if you're going to tell someone not to do something, you also believe that they feel the same way, right? We're arguing toward an objective, an outside standard. Well, if God is not real and we're just made up of atoms and flesh and blood and things like that, there's no such thing as any kind of moral outside standard. The only way we can have an outside standard, the only reason you could have even an argument with someone about what's right and what's wrong, or even if someone argues that God's real or not real, the only reason you can have an argument is that you would believe in an outside standard. And the only way you can have an outside standard is if something from outside is giving us these rules, right? So if morality is real, basically, if there is a right and wrong, then God exists. Hopefully that makes sense. Because if God didn't exist, then there would be no place for this to come from, this outside standard, something that comes from outside. Philosophers have these things called transcendentals. Transcendentals. Forgive me. I know this is very confusing, and it's confusing for me, honestly. But again, just for the sake of letting you guys know what's up. And what people say, and that there are arguments for this stuff. So the transcendentals are goodness, truth, beauty, being itself. These are all things that transcend material reality, right? There's things that transcend like the physical stuff of the universe. Goodness, truth, beauty. In order for goodness or morality to exist, they transcend reality, right? They have to come from outside. In order for truth to exist, it has to come from outside. It transcends physical reality. In order for beauty to exist, it's one thing to just have a preference for it, but if there's a real standard outside of your head, that has to come again from someplace outside. So if being, beauty, truth, goodness, right, which is basically morality, if any of these things exist, it has to come from outside. Again, another argument for this being that does come from outside, that must be good if we know what goodness is, must be true if we know what truth is, must be beautiful if we know what beauty is, must exist, right, have his being, and everything else, this being, be based on it. It must come from outside. So this thing that is eternally good, eternally true, eternally beautiful, and eternally existent, well, we call that, everybody knows, we call that God, right? Let's do one more. Yeah, we'll do one more. And this one, some of these are not persuasive at all to certain people, but some people find different ones persuasive. There's the argument for miracles. If miracles happen, there's no way for miracles to happen unless someone from out. If miracles exist, then God exists, right? And we have evidence of miracles, right? Now, again, that might be compelling to some people, might be less compelling to other people. Oh, my word, I see, I didn't see all of the people in the chat. Sorry if you answered a question. Doesn't look like I see any questions in there. If I missed your question, I apologize. My Facebook wasn't showing me the thing. Well, anyway, argument for miracles. Some people will say, well, miracles, if they don't believe in God, they probably don't believe in miracles. Here's the problem, though, with miracles, is miracles are very common. They're way more common than maybe you and I think, but chances are that most people you encounter either have experienced some kind of miracle or know someone who has, or more than likely they've experienced several things in their life that they would probably have little to no explanation for and would consider it some kind of miracle. Even people who don't believe in God, when they do these polls, there's a certain percentage of people that just don't believe in God, but there's even a greater percentage of people that do believe in miracles. So there are people who believe in miracles but don't believe in God. I know it's odd, but some people don't put two and two together. Don't put two and two together a lot of times. But if miracles exist, then that's evidence that God exists, right? And maybe we'll leave it at that. After all is said and done, here's how I'll close. I'll close with this, because I talked about this last 2 weeks ago. Whether or not, when we were talking about the accuracy of the Bible and knowing that the Bible is trustworthy. At the end of the day, none of that really matters unless you put your trust in it, right? None of it's going to matter. None of these arguments really matter unless you choose to put your trust in God, right? Which is a very separate and very personal question. And now, here again, there's even another argument for even choosing to believe it, right? So it's one thing to have these arguments, reasons to believe God exists, but it's another thing to say in your own mind, am I going to believe it, right? Which is the important thing for you and me, everybody watching. There was a guy named Pascal, and Pascal came up with this. It's not really an argument, but he calls it a wager, or at least we call it a wager. We call it Pascal's wager. What Pascal's wager said, and I'm going to botch this. I know I'm going to botch it. I botch it every time I try to explain it. It's so frustrating. But he said basically this. There's either two outcomes. Either God exists or God doesn't exist. Here's the two realities at the end of the day. No matter what we believe, there's two choices. Either God exists or God doesn't exist. Now, the question of your belief in God. If you choose to believe in God, and it turns out this second one's true, and he doesn't exist, what have you lost, Pascal asks. You haven't really lost much. If you believe in God, hopefully you get some good benefits of that. I know my life has been changed for the good, like 1,000 times over. So what have I lost from believing in God? And it turns out he doesn't exist. Well, I had a better life. I had happiness, I had joy, I had peace, I had these wonderful things. And if it comes to the end of my life and it turns out that God's not real, all of it wasn't real, then that's it, right? I basically haven't lost anything. If I choose to believe in God and it turns out he's not real, I haven't lost anything. And the only thing I really have lost is maybe some opportunity to sin or something along the way. You know what I mean? I suppose I could have gotten drunk a lot more and gotten into drugs a lot more and maybe fooled around with someone besides my wife a lot more. You know what I mean? Like, okay, fine, great. That's all that I've missed out on. But let's say I choose not to believe in God, and then it turns out that God exists. Well, now what have you lost? Pascal says, if that's the case, then you've lost everything, right? You've lost eternity. If it turns out that God exists and you chose not to believe in him. So, and here's where I botch it every time. So let's say let's say it's the case that God doesn't exist. Well, and you choose. There's a person who, maybe I think of it like this way. This person believes. This person doesn't believe. Then let's say it's a case that God doesn't exist. The outcome of at the end of the day is basically the same. It's a wash. Both ends up in nothingness, right? We both die. There's nothing. Okay. There's not really any big difference. The believer missed out on a couple opportunities for some extra sin, but at the end of the day, that's not much. Now, let's say it's the case that God exists. You got someone who believes it and someone who doesn't believe it. The person who believes in God has gained everything. The person who doesn't believe in God has lost everything. Pascal basically said, listen, it's costing you absolutely nothing, basically, to believe. You have nothing to lose, he says, and everything to gain, right? So it would just make sense on reason, even if you had no reasons to believe, which we do, it would make sense for you to even still believe that God exists. By all means, Pascal said, believe that he exists, right? You have nothing to lose and everything to gain. So even there in that choice that we have to choose whether or not to believe in God, that God exists, it still stands to reason that we would still want to believe in him had we no other reason to at all. But good news, we do have many reasons to believe. So for those of us that, for those of you who may still be wrestling with this question about choosing whether to believe, I would join in Pascal and say, by all means, choose to believe. I would much rather celebrate eternity with you than not. I'll close with that. Thanks for tuning in to Whiteboard Wednesday. We'll see you again next week, hopefully at our normal 7 p.m. time. Sorry for the waffling today, although I waffle every single time. All right, have a good night.